Good to see our weary travelers back. It's always nice to go off and for a little bit, but then it's nice to be home again too. Yeah. Good. If you will, turn to number 477. We'll start off. Shelter in the time of storm. 477. We'll sing 1, 2, and 4. The Lord's our rock, in him we hide, a shelter in the time of storm. Secure whatever ill betide, a shelter in the time of storm. Oh, Jesus is a rock in a weary land, a weary land, a weary land. Oh, Jesus is a rock in a weary land, a shelter in the time of storm. A shade by day, defense by night, a shelter in the time of storm. No fears alarm, no foes affright, a shelter in the time of storm. Oh, Jesus is a rock in a weary land, a weary land, a weary land. Oh, Jesus is a rock in a weary land, a shelter in the time of storm. O rock divine, O refuge dear, a shelter in the time of storm. Be thou our helper ever near, a shelter in the time of storm. Oh, Jesus is a rock in a weary land, a weary land, a weary land. Oh, Jesus is a rock in a weary land, a shelter in the time of storm. Dennis, would you start us off to word of prayer?
Holy Father, we humbly bow at this time, thanking you for the new day, giving you all praise, honor, and glory. Asking, Father, that you would bless us at this time as we enter into a study of your word. Help us to have open and receptive minds to your truths. We ask you to be with Mike as he breaks to us word of life. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Well, we'd like to welcome all those that are watching us on YouTube, and we hope that Naomi's not having to do physical therapy, but and I know Teresa's not doing it right now because I'm not there. So, so it's been a couple of busy days for Jesus. Matthew chapter 14. Jesus and his disciples have been busy. He had taught the multitudes a number of kingdom parables. Then, separating himself from the crowd, he went off by himself to try to find some peace and quiet. But his disciples followed him, and they asked him why he was teaching in parables, and then would he please explain a couple of the parables to them. Then, as a side note, Matthew tells us about Herod and the death of John the Baptizer, which would appear to mean that it was while Jesus was explaining these parables to his disciples that the disciples of John come to him and inform him of John's demise. At which point Jesus decides that he is going to leave the crowd behind and relocate to another place. However, some in the crowd saw Jesus and his disciples leaving, and so they decided to follow him. And soon word spread through the multitude, and they too began to follow. Some ran ahead to meet Jesus, while the rest of the crowd just kind of shuffled in. And during that time, Jesus was able to do a little bit of teaching to his disciples. But as the multitude arrives, Jesus looks up and sees them, has compassion on them. He begins to teach them more about the kingdom and as well as doing some healings. As evening approached, Jesus asked his disciples what they thought he should do. And they said, well, send them away. They got a couple miles to go before they come to a town where they can get some food and eat. But Jesus chose to feed them from 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes. Over 12,000 were completely filled, getting seconds and thirds if they wanted it, and then being able to pick up 12 baskets of fragments. And the fragments is just talking about the bread. It's not really talking about the fish itself. Verse 22, Matthew continues. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he sent the multitudes away. And when he had sent the multitudes away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. Now when evening came, he was alone there, but the boat was now in the middle of the sea, tossed by the waves, for the wind was contrary. Now in the 4th watch of the night, Jesus went to them, walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, "It is a ghost." And they cried out for fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Be of good cheer, it is I. Be not afraid." And Peter answered him and said, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." So he said, "Come." And when Peter had come down out of the boat, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw that the wind was boisterous, he was afraid. Beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand, caught him, said to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. That those who were in the boat came and worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." When they had crossed over, they came to the land of Gennesaret, if that's how you pronounce it, not sure. And when the men of that place recognized him, they sent out into all that surrounding region, brought to him all who were sick, begged him that he would only touch the hem of his garment, and as many as touched it were made perfectly well. Only Matthew and Mark record this incident in this particular way, with the exception of Mark informing us that Jesus sent his disciples to Bethsaida, which is the northmost port on the Sea of Galilee. Mark 6 and verse 45. Then we find John's record, who tells us that it was the time of the Passover when this took place. John chapter 6 and verse 4, which would make it about late March, early April. John's account in John chapter 6 puts things into perspective when adding Mark and Matthew's account to it. Only John gives us details of what happened the following day that Jesus sent his disciples away. And the multitudes again came to him. And we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but John tells us it was the next day that the multitudes began looking for Jesus. They didn't find him where he had fed them, so they searched around some more and finally decided to get into some boats, go to the other side of the sea to see if he was there. Still, they didn't find him or his disciples. So they came back to the other side, to Capernaum, and searched for him. And that's where they found him. And they asked when it was that he made his way to Capernaum. Jesus tells them that they were not really looking for him. They weren't looking for his teachings. They weren't looking for his miracles. They only came to him because he had fed them the day before. Then he begins a lesson on the bread of life. And this is in John chapter 6, which at that point is where his ministry began to suffer because of this lesson about the bread of life. Many of the people after that lesson chose to no longer follow him because of his teaching. John chapter 6 and verse 66. Notice it's 666, but Matthew says immediately Jesus sent his disciples away in a boat to go to the other side of the sea. So he would then send the multitudes away after that. Well, what was the cause of this immediacy for him to all of a sudden send his disciples away, and then he's going to send the multitudes away and go spend some time to himself? Well, John fills in for us what occurred in John chapter 6, verse 13 to 15. He said, "Therefore they gathered them together, filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves." So there we see it was the fragments of the barley loaves that were filled the baskets, which remained over and above unto them that had eaten. Then those men, when they had seen the miracle Jesus did, said, "This is a truth, that prophet that should come into the world." When Jesus perceived that they would come and take him by force to make him king, he departed into a mountain alone. So this gives us some information to understand what's happening here. Why suddenly he decides he's going to send his disciples away and himself go away. He's not going to allow these people to do something that's not within God's eternal plan. The people now saw Jesus because of the miracles they had been witnessing, but particularly the miracle of the bread and fishes. They now saw him as Judas Maccabeus reborn. Judas Maccabeus led the rebellion against the Seleucids in 167 BC. And it was from that family, the Maccabean family, that the Pharisees and Sadducees were born. Jesus' immediacy toward his disciples demonstrated his determination to drive away this irrational horde of people before things got out of hand. And we'll notice there are going to be a multitude of attempts in the coming chapters. Attempts by Jesus to gain some privacy for himself and his disciples, to travel into deserted areas to get away from the crowds. But it's not going to help. They're going to continue to follow him. Not as many as before this sermon on the bread of life. It's time for the people to kind of cool down from their desire to make him king. So he wants to get away from them. The people are not following him anymore for the spiritual things that he can offer them. only for the materialistic things. So in this one move to send away his disciples, for him to send the people away and then disappear himself, he saved his disciples and kept himself from being forced into a situation that would be of no benefit to anyone. What we find in this region is a fairly flat plain, almost level to the surface of the lake itself. In the background are hills, hills that rise no more than 3,000 feet above the surface of the lake. More like foothills than they are mountains. But Jesus climbs into these foothills to pray, which he does nearly all night. We're never told what Jesus prays when he goes off by himself. However, there's things we can kind of maybe assume. Would he not make mention of John's assassination? He just heard about that. Of the wickedness of Herod and his family. Certainly he would have prayed for more self-control for himself, to withstand the temptation to accept the earthly kingship that the people wanted of him. Would he not have prayed for guidance and strengthening of his 12 disciples? Or about the spiritual blindness of the multitudes, that God would open their minds to the truth? And most of all, would Jesus not have prayed that the Father help him keep his mind upon the goal of the eternal plan, as well as thanking the Father for allowing him to be the centerpiece of that plan? There are a number of things that Jesus would have prayed for. Verse 24, Matthew then turns his attention to the 12. They're sailing on the lake at night. And he says the boat is now in the middle of the sea. The wind of and the waves are preventing them from making it across. They're just kind of sitting in one place pretty much. They can go a little ways and the wind and the waves kind of push them back. John says they rode 25 to 30 furlongs when Jesus walked out to them. John 6, verse 19. 8 furlongs equals 1 mile. So they would have been 3 to 4 miles out on the lake. A lake that is 13 miles wide, 33 miles long. Verse 17 of John 6 says it was dark when Jesus had not yet arrived. Not the disciples were really watching for him, but they didn't expect him to come out there in the water to them. But John is merely making a statement based on what the Holy Spirit has told him. The wind, John says, was blowing against them. John 6 and verse 18. Undoubtedly, the sails had become useless. So the disciples now have to turn to rowing the boat to try to make some headway through this storm. Verse 25 of Matthew says it was during the 4th watch of the night that Jesus walked out to his disciples on the water. Now, as we pointed out before, the Romans had divided the night into 4 watches for guard duty. 4 watches of 3 hours each. The first watch began at 6 6 in the evening to 9, 6 to 9 p.m. was the first watch. So it would have been during this period of time that the disciples had entered the boat, started their journey toward Bethsaida. Now John says they were going to Capernaum. John 6:17. But Mark says they were going to Bethsaida. Capernaum and Bethsaida are really considered one and the same place. Capernaum being the larger towns, Bethsaida kind of being like a suburb. You know, it'd be like me saying, well, I'm going to St. Louis tomorrow, when in reality I'm going to go to St. Peter's. Which is part of St. Louis. The text doesn't tell us that the disciples had been fighting the storm all night or the entire way. They probably wouldn't have gone at all if the storm was already going when they first started. So it was probably between 3 and 6 a.m., the fourth watch. Disciples had been fighting the storm at the very least probably 2 or 3 hours, which would, of course, seem like an eternity while you're out there trying to row and get somewhere. Not as if these men had never encountered storms on this lake before. Being fishermen, they would have seen plenty of storms like this. And maybe even, most likely, even got caught in them. Fighting the fatigue that is definitely encompassing them, as well as the hunger due to the excess use of carbs and rowing against the wind and the waves and that. Coupled with that, the need for rest after 2 days of hard work. You know, they're distressed. Mark says Jesus saw their distress from the high point that he was on. He could look down on the lake and he could see them trying to make their way. Mark 6:47. Now remember, this was the Passover season. And during at this particular time of the month, there would be a full moon that would light up the lake. Now, there's nothing said about this being a rainstorm or a thunderstorm, which would have hid the moon. It was simply just a strong wind that came through. Having the same compassion for his disciples as he had for the hungry multitudes, Jesus decides to walk out to them. The same Jesus who is able to change water into grape juice, who healed hordes of sick, had just fed 12,000 people, would now use his power to stop the wind and the waves, as well as to walk out on the water. Matthew says the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went unto them walking on the sea. Verse 25. Mark says about the fourth watch of the night, he cometh unto them walking upon the sea, and would have passed them by. Mark 6:48. Now, there should be no question as to the fact this was a miracle. Yet there are always critics, always naysayers. And there are some who deny that this was a miracle, that Jesus actually walked on the water. Because they say the Greek allows for several different interpretations. So it could mean that Jesus walked upon the water, on the water, at the sea, over the sea, towards the sea, even around the sea. from the one Greek word. Therefore, they conclude, when Jesus saw these distressed disciples, he went toward the shore to help them. When he got to the shore, he walked through the surf and the waves toward their boat. Yet the same Greek words are used to refer to Peter walking on the water. And they say nothing about that. If Peter had jumped out of the boat in shallow water like they say that Jesus was in when he came out to help them, then why would Jesus rebuke Peter for having little faith? They're not expecting to see him. Their focus is on fighting the waves, making it to shore. And as Jesus comes out to them, they cry out in fear, "It's a ghost." Now keep in mind it's dark, and the only light that there is the full moon, which could make a figure appear shadowy at best. The Greek word here for ghost means a vision, a false appearance, a dream, a reflection, an apparition. What is meant by Mark when he said Jesus would have passed them by has caused various remarks as to why Jesus would do that. One, he didn't want his disciples, in their terror, to jump out of the boat and drown, which how could they drown if they were in waist-deep water? So he chose to not go out and get directly into the boat. Number two, he chose this as an illustration that he was not going to be saved by them if he climbed in the boat, but they would be saved by him. And then another thought, he thought it would cause them to cry to him for help. So at their crying out, "It's a ghost," Jesus immediately answers them, "Be of good cheer. It is I. Be not afraid." You know, here we see a little bit of humor to kind of cause their fears to subside. You know, cheer up, my brothers. It's only me. Don't be nervous. You know, basically. Verse 28, recognizing that it is indeed Jesus, without even thinking, Peter answered, "Lord, if it really is you, then allow me to come out to you upon the waters." There's no doubt that Peter believes it is Jesus. The Greek literally reads, "Since it is you," instead of "if." Why the translators chose to make it appear as if Peter doubts that it's Jesus, don't know what their motives were. Matthew adds 4 verses concerning Peter and his account, which Mark chose to leave out. Perhaps Matthew did so to show the importance of Peter to the early church as things go on. Something we'll begin to see more and more as time closes in on the end of Jesus' ministry and the apostles take over. As God the Father had conferred power upon Jesus at his baptism, Jesus conferred his power upon the 12 when he sent them out on the limited commission. Once again, he invites Peter to come out on the water to show it's possible to the others. Here, Peter must place his trust in Jesus to confer his power to him to perform this miracle. Notice, Jesus did not tell him, no, stay in the boat. Otherwise, others may assume that you have the same power as I do. Didn't say that, did he? Knowing the thoughts of men, he accepts the faith that Peter has and consents to Peter's proposal. Sure, come on out. The water's fine. So it's going to take a lot of courage for Peter to step out that boat onto the surface of the water, particularly in these heavy waves with the wind blowing. And it's not calm. The winds are still blowing, the waves are still trying to sink the boat. It was only after he took his eyes off Jesus, focused upon the wind and the waves, that he began to sink. He was doing fine until he started thinking about the waves around him. Verse 30, when Peter saw the wind, he was afraid. How did Peter see the wind? Well, he didn't actually see the wind, did he? He saw the effects of the wind with the waves, causing the waves. So at that point, he takes his mind off Jesus and focuses upon the wind and the waves and begins to sink. Now it's apparent that Jesus is close enough to Peter that he was able to stretch out his hand and grab a hold of him. Verse 31. By holding Peter's hand, Jesus caused Peter to regain his trust in the Lord. And Jesus gives him a gentle rebuke. O ye of little faith, why did you doubt? His mistake was taking his eyes off Jesus, putting his focus upon material things. He had done so well in the beginning, but allowed doubt to take over his faith. James points out a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. James 1 and verse 8. And in that context, he talks about doubting. Peter did far more, even though he doubted, even though he began to sink, he did far more than the other apostles did. He at least tried, while the rest of them stayed in the safety of the boat. Little faith has nothing to do with intellectual understanding, but has everything to do with the depth of our confidence. Our depth spiritually over our depth worldly. Then we notice in verse 32 that it was only when everyone including Jesus, were in the boat, what happened? The wind stopped. Yeah. Which would then cause what? The waves to cease as well. Matthew chapter 8, verse 27. Mark chapter 4 and verse 41 speaks of another incident like this, where Jesus stopped the wind and the waves. And his disciples asked themselves, what manner of man is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? But it wasn't until the second time, the same miracle, that they recognize him as the Son of God. Verse 32. They recognize him as the Messiah. All the miracles they've witnessed to this point, they were surprisingly slow to accept the fact that he was the Messiah. Despite all the miracles he's done, despite him teaching them, and him saying and telling the Pharisees in front of them that he was the Messiah, they were slow in accepting that. Why? What took them so long to realize? I think it was their unwillingness to let go of their Jewish mindedness. And what do we mean by Jewish mindedness? Only accepting the Jewish preconceived idea of what the Messiah was, what he would do. They were looking for a Messiah that would come and establish an earthly kingdom, who would rid the world of the Romans. That's what they wanted. That's what it was that caused Jesus to send his disciples away immediately. Because that's what the people wanted to do. They were going to rise up. And you've got this multitude. You've got 12,000 people here, 5,000 men that could force him to become king. And the disciples were no different. They were thinking the same way. But now their eyes are beginning to open. They're beginning to see that they've been understanding the Scriptures wrong. Verse 34, when they had crossed over. Now remember, the disciples were headed to the north end of the lake, between Capernaum and Bethsaida. But Mark and Matthew said they crossed over to Gennesaret. Is that a town or what? Village? No, I always thought of it as on the other side of the lake, a little piece of land over there. But I was wrong. It is a plain south of Capernaum, on the west side of the lake. It's a plain that's 3.7 miles long, 2.5 miles wide. It's kind of an area just south of Capernaum. Now, some believe that the wind had pushed them toward this area rather than Bethsaida. So Jesus just instructed his disciples, go ahead and row ashore here. We'll just land here instead of going up to where we had planned. But the text says it was here that they landed after the wind ceased. Possibly because of the wind had kind of pushed them that way. Don't know. But Josephus describes this area as the perfect tourist spot of the day. It was like an oasis. The land with the soil was so fertile and everything, trees and all kinds. It was a garden, basically. In the southeast corner of this garden was the village Magdala, the home of Mary Magdalene. So upon landing on shore, immediately the people began to recognize him. Verse 35, remember, is the day after he'd fed them, and they're looking for him. And they find him, and word gets out quickly. All right, he's here. And they begin to bring their sick for him to heal. And gradually Jesus made his way through the multitudes 2.5 miles north to Capernaum, where he arrives, goes into the synagogue. It's in the synagogue that he preaches his sermon on the bread of life, John chapter 6. Here we see in this area a completely different frame of mind of the people compared to Jesus' hometown in Nazareth. His hometown people, they wouldn't even think of bringing their sick to him to be healed. But these people can't get close enough to him for healing. They're just piling in with all their sick just to be able to touch his garment. That's all they want to do. If they can just touch his garment, they know they'll be healed. And Matthew says that they were. Just by a touch of the garment. Does that remind you of anybody else?
The lady, I think she was, I don't know if she believed or what, that she had,
12 years?
yeah,
Uh-huh.
touched the
Yeah.
tent, and that's when he said, "Who touched me?" Because he felt the power.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The lady who'd spent all she had on doctors and everything, they couldn't ever heal her. And she had it in her mind, if I can just touch the hem of his garment, I'll be healed. Yeah. And these people have the same mindset. All I need to do is just touch him. That much faith. Just think if Peter had kept that much faith, he wouldn't have sunk. Any questions, thoughts? Yeah, Dennis.
Almost get seasick thinking about that picture. Because the boat, it's got to be, it's a fairly small boat, it's fishing or whatever. Luxury type.
Yeah, I mean, they're bigger than what we would think. You because you have 12 men in it. It'd be probably about the size of the lifeboats on the Titanic. That type of boat, or a little bit bigger.
The boat's got to be bobbing in a sense with all the waves coming in.
Yeah.
The boat wouldn't be turned sideways with the incoming wave. It would be either away from that or toward that. That still gives it this kind of emotion.
Mm-hmm.
Peter, when he steps out of the boat, he's doing this.
Yeah.
Jesus walking on the water,
He's.
he's doing this.
Mm-hmm.
The implication's almost that not only are they close together, they're close together in terms of being parallel with the incoming waves. Otherwise,
Mm-hmm.
extend your hand this way or extend
Oh,
your hand
yeah.
Anyway, it's a very dynamic thing.
Yeah, it is. I mean, we often think about it. Jesus came out walking on a calm. No. No, he's bobbing around too. And Peter. So, yeah. I know Terry's thought is she wishes it was winter, so it was cooler.